Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be looking at how research in parapsychology is conducted. This is an interview that will be of interest for those of you who want to know and for those of you who might be considering actually doing parapsychology research. With me is Stephan Schwartz, who has been engaged in the field of parapsychology for half a century. He is the author of several books, including The Alexandria Project, The Secret Vaults of Time, Opening to the Infinite, and The 8 Laws of Change, How to Become an Agent for Personal and Social Transformation. Stephan is also one of the founders of the International Remote Viewing Association. He is a columnist for the journal Explore, the Journal of Science and Healing, former editor of the journal Subtle Energies. Welcome, Stephan.
Good. How are you?
I'm great, and it's great to be with you once again. We've done many interviews so far, so our viewers, our regular viewers at this point, will have a good sense of your background doing research in the area of therapeutic intention and the area of the application of remote viewing and archaeology. But now we're going to focus on some of the details because I happen to think that the work you do is exemplary, and the methodology and protocols that you employ are worth being studied, not only by our viewers, but by others who are professional parapsychologists as well. And I know you do a lot of preparation before you begin any project.
You need, in my view, to write down in great detail, and I mean great detail, the model of the random number generator you're using, exactly how you're going to do whatever it is you're going to do. Write it all up and write the hypotheses that you think you're testing and circulate that not only to people who are supportive of what you're doing, but also people who are in opposition. Personally, I hate to be embarrassed. Most people don't like to be embarrassed, but I really don't like to be embarrassed. And the way that I have dealt with that in terms of research protocols or research over the years is I create what I call this protocol and hypotheses document. And I circulate it, and the reason I do that, I send it to people and I say, take it apart and tell me what you think is wrong. Because I want people to criticize it before I do it, not after. I don't want to make a report of a study and have somebody say, well, if only you had used the Mark 1 Mod 0 widget, then you wouldn't have gotten that result.
Right.
And in fact, to give you an example, I did, some years ago, I did 2 large-scale tests in Omni magazine, not only in the United States, but in Japan and in Europe. And I circulated my P&H document beforehand, and I sent it to
protocol and hypotheses.
And I sent it to a very well-known denier. I make a difference between skeptics and deniers. I would consider you and I to be skeptics. That is, we question, and that's the reason you do experiments. Deniers are people who fundamentally just, this can't be true because it can't be true. So anyway, I circulated it to a very well-known denier, and he wrote back and said, I would only accept this experiment if you used a particular model of a random number generator, and only if you had it configured in a certain way.
Because virtually every research experiment is going to require randomization at some point.
Yes. And so I was able, happily, because I had done my research, to write back to him and say, that's exactly the one we're using. Mm-hmm. So can we agree that if we get positive results, that you're not going to be publishing, if only they had used whatever, I don't remember, whatever the model was. Yeah. And I had to get him on record. Mm-hmm. And of course, as a result of that, he said nothing when we finally published. So yes, there are basically two issues that you have to work with in designing non-local consciousness experiments. One is you have to really think through the variables that are in play in your experiment. And one of the variables is blindness, and the other is randomization. Mm-hmm. So what you're trying to do is to design an experiment in which the only way the experiment can be accomplished successfully, that you can get a positive result, is that non-local consciousness was the source of the information. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's the basic principle. Right. So you want to eliminate things like cueing, even body language cueing. I mean, there are lots of studies that show, for instance, that the attitude and expectation of the researcher has a very strong effect on the performance of the person who is the percipient in the experiment.
And that's known across all of psychology.
Oh, yes. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. It's all through. So you have to design the experiment so that all of those subtle nuances get dealt with. Mm-hmm. I personally prefer to do triple-blind experiments.
And what does that mean?
Well, this is what I was going to say. Yeah. A typical experiment, most experiments that people do are double-blind. That is, at the time that you're doing the experiment, both the person who is the participant, who's producing the non-local data, and the researcher who's working with them are blind to whatever the right answer is. Mm-hmm. That's a double-blind experiment. A single-blind experiment would be the researcher knows, but the percipient doesn't know. Mm-hmm. I prefer triple-blind experiments. For the reason I cited, it just obviates another level of criticism. And so a typical remote viewing experiment that I would do would be to ask you to describe a target which, at the time you're describing it, has not yet been selected. Mm-hmm. So nobody knows what the answer is. So you have to create blindness so that it cannot be claimed that somebody knew the answer and might, through the wink of an eye or the posture of their body or something they said or, I don't know.
Subtle cueing.
Yeah, some kind of subtle cueing that they could have conveyed the right answer. I mean, I can remember when I first got into doing this kind of research, I remember going to a professional research meeting, and there was a claim made that people were climbing into the attic of the building and drilling through the ceiling, and that they were somehow alerting the participant.
That's the famous criticism made by C.E.M. Hansel of the early research by J.B. Rhine and
exactly
and Pratt.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm. The Pratt-Pierce experiments.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it sounds preposterous,
right?
But
he kept repeating it over and over.
Absolutely.
Again, because he found a little, I think, a knothole in the floor or something of the ceiling above.
Yeah, exactly. So you just eliminate all that. Mm-hmm. It's much easier to conceptualize the experiment and go through it and think, okay, then I'm going to do this, and then I'll do that, and it'll be in this environment, and all of that, and deal with all that kind of nonsense at the front end so that you don't have some guy standing up where you present your paper saying, well, there was a knothole in the ceiling, and, it could have been, I don't say that it happened, but it could have happened, and so you just eliminate all that stuff.
Yeah.
So first, you want to create really well understood and well defined and secure blindness. And the second thing is you want to create randomization. And there's a number of companies that produce random number generators, and you have to do a little research on the web to find out which is the correct one, but it's not terribly hard to do.
Because if your random number generator is biased, a critic will say that somehow your percipients were able to detect that bias, and so it's not really non-local consciousness, it's a question of subliminal computation or something of that sort.
Exactly. And then a third, and really this is a very subtle nuance there, data augmentation theory, an idea that was developed by a researcher named Ed May, that the real agent of action, because one of the questions in these experiments is, who is the agent of action? And that you're pushing the button at just, you, the researcher, are pushing the button at just the moment when that will produce the answer that you want.
When you start the experiment.
Yeah, when you start the experiment.
Example, and it's almost impossible theoretically to say that the percipient is really the person producing the psi event rather than the judges or the experimenters or people who observe the results of the experiment 12 months in the future.
Yes, and so, for instance, to give you an example of a way I used to deal with that, I did an experiment, a remote viewing experiment, and in which about 3,000 people participated. And to do this experiment, now you would do it a little differently today because this was back still when film was used, but you could do it with tablets or whatever. I built a box, and in the box I put 2 projectors, and each contained 72 slides. And I put in a computer, and then I put in another computer. And twice a day, we would reseed the first computer, and then it would, at a time that its random number generator selected, reseed the second computer, and the second computer would then reseed the controller that projected the slides, so that, and they changed every 20 minutes. We had no idea what a record was kept, but in the box. But during the time that it was running, the box was unopened, and so it ran 24 hours a day. The slide changed every 20 minutes. That was it projected the slide on a little tiny screen in the box, which was sealed and then put in a locked closet, so that there was just no question. It was a triple blind experiment, and anybody could take part in the experiment at any time they wanted. Dean Radin at Noetics has another variant of that on online.
The Institute of Noetic Sciences.
Yes. Dean has a very elegant experiment. It's been running for years now, and millions of people have taken part in it. So it's possible to do this. I mean, you can get around all of these objections if you really think through very carefully what it is you're trying to accomplish. Now, in the application experiments, a part of the challenge is that you basically have to create 4 teams. The way that the Mobius consensus protocol, which was the protocol I used for doing the applied experiments
in archaeology,
in criminology, and geology. I mean, we used it in a lot of different variants. I created 2 basic protocols. Other people created other protocols. The 2 I created were associated remote viewing and the Mobius consensus protocol. And that protocol uses multiple viewers. It's basically the same idea that suppose you and I heard some kind of an explosion outside of this building, and we ran out and there was a mob of people who had seen it. And what would you do? Well, you would take them aside one at a time. Well, what did you see? What did you see? Recognizing that everybody doesn't see everything correctly. They don't remember things correctly. There are cultural biases. This is something that is not widely discussed, or I don't even think recognized, even in the research community. For instance, I did a study between Japanese and Americans. And the challenge for the participants was, do a remote viewing and put the answer into one of 5 categories: mountains, land-water interfaces, cities, technological installations, farmland.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in fact, there was no target. There never was a target. What I was trying to get at, and what I did get at, I think, is, are there cultural biases that influence the way people do viewings?
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, what we discovered was, to a highly significant degree, Japanese chose mountains and Americans chose land-water interfaces.
Mm.
And I looked at that data for a while and was thinking about, why would that be true? And then I thought, well, culturally, Mount Fuji is a major iconic image in the Japanese culture. There are songs and traditions and poems and about Mount Fuji.
Mm-hmm.
And in America, we celebrate land-water interfaces. We are a nation of immigrants. And so from sea to shining sea, Shenandoah, the rolling river. And
mm-hmm.
I mean, we have all these cultural memes about land-water interfaces.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I think probably because we are a nation of immigrants and everybody came from somewhere else. And so it became clear in looking at this research that there was a real bias if you had to only pick those 5 categories, that there was a cultural bias
mm-hmm.
that was completely invisible.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing you have to look at, we have discussed in these interviews the idea of numinosity.
Yes.
And one of I did another study to look at this issue of numinosity, and discovered that, for instance, well, as an example of the actual thing, an Irish lyre. Now, if you happen to be
you mean a musical
Brazilian
instrument?
The instrument, yes, a picture. So I did a series in which the targets were musical instruments, and of various kinds. And what I discovered was that Irish people tended to displace, and let me say a bit about that. What we discovered early on in remote viewing was that there was a third outcome we had not anticipated. You get it right, you get it wrong. That's pretty straightforward. But the other was that there was something in the target set that was so compelling to you that you chose that. It's different than you describe accurately one of the targets in the target set, but not the one that gets picked. When you create a target set and you're doing something where you're asking to describe a target that you're going to see in the future, what you're doing by creating a target set, and let's distinguish between a target set and a target pool. I have a target pool on my computer of about 1,200 targets. And they're easy to get. People ask me all the time, where do you get all those targets? I get them off of the net. You just go to one of the search engines and start searching. For instance, I do it in categories, and I pick images, and you just download the image. I mean, you're not commercially using it. You don't really violate any copyright issues. So you download these targets. So that's your target pool. That's all the targets that you have that can be pulled. And if you're going to create a target set, which is essentially the target set is all the potential futures that could occur in that session. Say 5, and you want 5 to 7 so that you can get a statistical outcome. So you have 5 to 7 targets per set. Well, so when you select and you have a random, you can do this with a random number generator that you want to get what are called orthogonal targets. Now, orthogonal is a mathematical term, but in the case of remote viewing, what it means is targets which are very distinct from one another. For instance, you would not put a tennis ball and an orange in a target set. Because if I said to you, well, you know, it's something sort of round, and if you squeeze it, and it has a texture on the surface, how would you distinguish between the orange and the tennis ball?
Right.
The only way you could do that is if I happen to say it was orange. But I might not say that. So that's not an orthogonal target. A tennis ball and a pair of scissors would be an orthogonal target. Because the things that you would say about a scissors and the things that you would say about a tennis ball are quite distinct. And you want to also be aware when you're designing this that what you get in a remote viewing session, because you don't want to get analytical overlay. You're specifically not asking them to identify what the target is. You are asking people to give you sense impressions, taste, touch, smell, and what I call knowingness. That is, something about the target that they simply know. Because what people are doing is they're not going to the target, they're going to they're opening to the non-local domain of consciousness, where I guess you could say all that is to be found, and these are informational architectures. And so you want to get sense impressions, and you sometimes, not always, you sometimes get knowingness. Mostly sense impressions, but sometimes knowingness.
There's a lot of individual variation.
Yes, I mean, you know, there's not. This is not like baking cookies. You know, where you put a cup of flour and 2 tablespoons of chocolate, and you know, it's not quite that cut and dried. People have, and they have biases. We'll get to that in a second. So anyway, you select your targets out of your target pool to create your target set. Your target set are orthogonal targets. That is, none of them would be considered from sense impressions to be similar. So it's the tennis ball and the scissors. Now, so if I had 5 targets, and let's say I had a tennis ball, I had a scissors, I had a pair of eyeglasses, that's 3. 4, I had a sponge, and 5, I had
a flower.
A flower, yes, okay. So now we have 5 potential futures. Suppose I did a session with you. Well, let's suppose, and I'll give you a specific example of how I learned this, but suppose you're a gardener and you love flowers. So the target that was selected might be the sponge. If you described a pillow, you would just be wrong. But if you described the flower, you would do what we call displacement. That is, you would accurately describe one of the potential futures in that comprise the target set, but not the one that was actualized.
It's a problem that has kind of bedeviled researchers for quite a while.
Yes, and so you have to, as I said about the lyre, I discovered that if the lyre was there and I had an Irish native, that they would I actually did. That's how I learned it. They displaced to the lyre because an Irish lyre is a very powerful symbol in the Irish culture.
Very compelling at a psychological, subconscious level.
Exactly. I learned this. One of the other founders, there's a little group of us that founded remote viewing. One of the other founders is a man named Russell Targ. And Russell had a daughter named Elizabeth, who became a physician and a researcher, did a very important therapeutic intention study.
Yeah, quite a few, as I recall.
A lovely woman died, unfortunately.
A dear friend of both of us.
Anyway, I asked Elizabeth, she was down visiting, and I asked her to be a participant in a remote viewing experiment. I had been given by Russell, he wanted to test an idea he had. Yeah. I had been given by Russell bags. In each of the bag, these little brown sealed bags, like sandwich bags, he had put objects. Mm-hmm. And so the thing was that each bag was numbered, yep. And so we used the random number generator to select the target set from the target pool, and I didn't know what was in the bags, so everybody's blind, and so we did the thing, and she displaced. The target was actually a napkin holder, but what she said was. And Elizabeth was a good viewer, and you'll see this in a second. She said, well, I see this thing, and it's got these two round pieces of glass, and there's some kind of plastic frame, and there are hinges, this thing. Now, you'll note she did not say eyeglasses. Right. She did not try to analyze. She simply reported sense impressions. That's how you see the difference between a naive viewer and an experienced viewer is that they learn to deal with what we call analytical overlay, mm-hmm. This compulsion that we have because it's cultural and also it's genetic. I mean, it's hardwired into our bodies to detect and to try to analyze. What is this out of partial information? Mm-hmm. So she described very clearly. She says it's kind of brownish, and there's this other little part that goes like this, and she made a little drawing but as it turned out, the target was a napkin holder. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't figure out why. She was so detailed. And we were putting the targets away, and the woman who was doing it had talked to Russell about the targets, and I said, I just don't understand why she described the eyeglasses. Mm-hmm. And the woman said, well, I called Russell up and asked him. And he said, that's just an old pair of glasses of mine that I found in a desk. I had them, probably 25 years ago. And I thought, well, obviously that's what she displaced to. You're a tiny baby. Your father is holding you lovingly. You look up at his face, and there are the tortoiseshell glasses that he was wearing when you were a baby. Mm-hmm. And so she had displaced to that because that had been a very powerful symbol. Mm-hmm. Russell is very, very nearsighted. And in fact, I think he's legally blind. So for her, that when you looked up at your father, that was a really powerful symbol, mm-hmm. and she had displaced to it. Yeah. That's how I got interested originally in mm-hmm. displacement, because I hadn't ever thought about that. Mm-hmm. So you have to, when you're designing your target set, you have to think about who is going to be your participant, who your viewers are going to be. Mm-hmm. And make sure that you have no targets in your target set that would cause them to displace, because they had because those targets were so numinous, mm-hmm. they were so emotionally engaging that there would be a temptation to describe mm-hmm. that displacement as opposed to the actual target mm-hmm. that gets selected.
Of course, you can't always know, but and in spite of displacement, for decades and decades, parapsychologists have consistently gotten significant statistical results.
Yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are now about 12 protocols. The most recent one is a really elegantly designed protocol.
We're running out of time, so I don't want to go into great detail about it. But yes, it's true, and we've covered it. There are many protocols that provide good data.
Yeah, there are about 12 protocols, each of which have 6 sigma results. That is mm-hmm. 1 in a billion, mm-hmm. and where 1 in 20 is considered significant. So I guess the final thing I want to say is, when you design this kind of a laboratory experiment, I suggest that you go to your local college and you go to the mathematics department and you have someone who is statistically significant, because there are a number of ways to do this, help you design how to do the statistical analysis. And there are several ways to do it. So once you do that and you have your target set, your target pool, your statistical analysis, you've handled blindness, you've handled randomization so that the target is randomly selected. You do it triple blind optimally. you have, at very low cost, something anybody could do. High school students could do this, have done it. You are set up to do a real scientific experiment.
Stephen Schwartz, a person who has conducted many real scientific experiments, thank you so much for being with me.
My pleasure.
And thank you for being with us.